Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. Today we're going to do a nice free-flowing conversation. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and I'm joined by my French partner in these episodes, Andrew Hauk. So Germany and France are going up against the United States today, I guess, in almost a literal sense, as we are encouragingly finding out about all this Greenland stuff. And joining us today again, had him a little while ago, Carney from Stephen Austin University in Texas. And you already know him a little bit, PhD from the university, oh, sorry, from that other university, that Louisiana State thing, in Baton Rouge. Um, Great works on music, Bob Dylan, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, which we have previously talked about. So today, kind of building on the conversation from last time, we thought we're going to talk a little about Shelby Foote, Ken Burns, myth making memories, yeah, the way certain popular individuals can change things, unfortunately, in negative ways. So, to start us off, I thought we're all going to talk briefly about how we first encountered Shelby Foote, and mine is going to be a very easy thing. I was still fairly young, coming to the States for the first time in 98. And I think it was in the following summer I got I want to say it was volume three was the first volume that I received in a bookstore in the US. And then every year thereafter, when I came visit the States, we bought another book until I had all three of them. And I read them. I read the whole thing, top to bottom. You can't see them. They're the tops of them. If you looked up to them, there's still a lot of sticky notes in those volumes that I never bothered to take out. Yeah, that was first encounters that I had. Fascinating page-turning read. Of course, I know better today.
Hmm. So mine was it was the Civil War series, the Ken Burns series. I was in what was it? Came out in the late 80s, 89, right? 90. So I guess I was in middle school when it came out, and the most memorable episode for me was the second one where it deals with the Battle of Shiloh, and that's where I really got some got hooked on Shelby Foote at the time, especially with Court here talking about that account of Nathan Bedford Forrest pulling the soldier up on his horse to escape the I don't know the dog pile at some point in the battle. So that was Shelby Foote for me was the guy who talked about Nathan Bedford Forrest, and then of course throughout the rest of the Ken Burns series, really made an impact. And there was I think it's pretty safe to say that I was easily swayed by the Lost Cause at that time, and so for me, with that soothing voice of his and that drawl and his very excellent way of telling stories, it really made a huge impact on the way I viewed the Civil War, and it was hard for me to break um, that hold that he had on my subconscious, I guess, when it comes to the Civil War memory and all that. So yeah, Shelby Foote, a positive and ultimately a negative memory for me.
Yeah, I was high school. So this would have been when I first watched when it first came out, I was in high school, the Ken Burns series. I would have seen that. I was really into that for whatever that means. Um, there's a side note to all of this that is particularly sort of curious, but I went to, and this is in San Antonio. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. And my high school was Robert E. Lee High School. And San Antonio does not play a large role in the Civil War, but my high school was Robert E. Lee, and we were for the first several years of my high school festooned with the Confederate flag. I was in the marching band, so our uniforms were the Confederate flag, and we played Dixie and all that kind of stuff. And there's a primal story here for me as Lee is the high school is requesting or is being requested to change its iconography. Um, right when I think I was a junior in high school. So right around the same time, I'm listening to Ken Burns and Foote and all this stuff. And there was a pretty big fight about getting rid of the Confederate flag. This would have been 91 probably. And the Ku Klux Klan shows up. And I think somewhere in the recesses of
Wow.
my brain, um, there's a lot of stuff that kind of comes to fruition later in my subconscious, unconscious. I think you'd have to have some more work done with the shadow self and a Jungian analysis to get into all this. But I do think there's something there with all that, and I think that it's fascinating that, like what you were saying, Andrew, it helped shape a lot of what I saw as the war, but it also shaped how I saw history. And I think it took some doing. And I think one of the things we can talk about later too is like kind of the construction of this as a narrative, but also just as like telling a story, history as telling a story, which when you're younger, certainly, and for a lot of people forever, is kind of the thing. And
Yeah.
most of my work and most of everything I've done since then is sort of not that. But when you're 17, when you're trying to figure out what does it mean, I like history. I'm going into college. What does that mean as a mate? What Shelby Foote was there, and so I got the trilogy because of Ken Burns. I was gifted that for a gift. You know, they had that box set. I think that's what you have, Neil's that sort of
Yeah,
paperback.
yeah.
Because you get the same books that I do. So yeah.
So when you contacted me about doing this, I started thinking, there's a kind of a vulnerability with Foote because I think there were a lot of people who were dismissive of Foote immediately, and there were people who were working historians who were dismayed at how Ken Burns was shaping this. And I remember reading some of those articles when I was in college, and I was like kind of like not quite understanding what they were getting at. And I think the vulnerability for me is kind of saying that he was someone that did have a big influence in the sense of I would be lying if I said I didn't have I knew about Forrest before him, and I'm pretty sure this is true, that it's probably Foote that introduced me to Forrest, and then I got into the debunking and the memorialization after that. And soon after, we're talking about those moments that spark. We're not talking about the moments that you carry with you. Like I was never like a Foote, I was never a Foote soldier. I was never
Ah,
a Foote's foot soldier. That was never the case. But it's amazing to see like, well, like here is a very well received, very loud version of events, but more than that, a way of looking at events that a lot of people shared, and a lot, and that's that kind of traditional, however you want to look at it historiographically. There's something there to that had to bend and then ultimately break. But I think that that's probably true for a lot of people.
hmm,
It's kind of funny is that you both have Ken Burns sort of as your memory at a young age, and I s- I can't tell you right now off the top of my head if I ever have watched the entirety of the Ken Burns series,
It was a big
but
deal.
I know I
yeah. I
but
mean,
I
it really was huge.
yeah, but like it didn't come to Germany where I grew up at the time.
I had, oh, did we freeze up? Oh, I had I can't remember how it came to me, but I had like the sheet music to Ashokan Farewell, the
Yes,
theme.
had it
I
too.
remember getting that. I don't know how that was. I don't know if that was a PBS spectacular thing. I don't know, but I don't know where that is. That'd be a funny
It's
talk about
literally
Proust. We can talk about Proust later, but talk about a kind of a Proustian sort of vision melody. That's something interesting.
well, it's the only song that I know from memory on the piano.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can play the whole thing with both hands on the piano.
Oh my
Well,
gosh.
I'd be remiss at this point because I talk about this in the Forest book, but what's interesting about that is that it is not an old song. It
All
was,
right.
it dates back to like the early 80s or late 70s. But it's given to the public as like this ancient sort of
Hmm.
uh uh cadence, this kind of historical cadence. And it's I think it shows you without putting too much on this, I think it shows you the craft of Burns, and there's a lot you can deconstruct negatively and talk about this and the other. And I'm not saying that one way or the other, but what I am saying is that he's able to craft things in a way that create these hooks, and the music plus the panning of the photographs. I think that has in terms of simply a documentarian viewpoint, is quite important. What he does with that narratively, what he does with that in terms of the ideologies embedded in that, um, I think is probably more worthy of discussion. But I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah,
And
and
I know
also,
I know so many people who thought that Ashton Farewell was just like a Civil War song. It's like no, I mean I didn't
well,
know it wasn't.
well,
Like
and
I was a
then
kid.
and Jerry Prokopowicz, for years and years, used a version of Ashokan Farewell for the intro
isn't he
of
still doing
Civil
that?
War Talk Radio. No, 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 because he changed platforms,
Oh, okay.
and so had didn't have rights to whatever.
Oh,
So
okay.
he found a song. It's a new song. I haven't listened in a while, but it's not the same. It's not the
Right.
same music.
Yeah.
But the
But
power
I
of
mean,
that melody is the Civil War for a lot of people. Like that's it.
yeah.
And
Me.
Mhm.
it's based on old fiddle tunes, all that kind of stuff, and so it has like a resonance to it that I think also can't be dismissed in terms of why people found this. I mean, I don't think
Mhm.
we're going to get into truth versus truth, but I mean, there's something there about how people found it um, in terms of building their confidence as to what this is, maybe.
Well, and going back to Foote, the way he speaks in
Mhm.
the series. I mean, he has you talk about hooks. You know, the
Mhm.
music. You've got the filmmaking. You've got the Ken Burns effect with the the panning over the photographs. But you've also got Shelby Foote's soothing, kind of authoritative telling of these
Mhm.
stories that make everything. He gives life to these events that.
Well, what I was going to say, we could edit, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah.
What there's an important piece to all this. I think what Andrew's talking about though is that Foote has a certain authority, and he speaks with
Mhm.
a certain authority because he has a kind of a charming cadence to him. I
Mhm.
don't remember if he actually is smoking a pipe on camera, but he clearly was smoking a pipe right off of camera. And it's this sort of, I think most of his interviews are probably done in his home in Memphis. And
Mhm.
so you have this sort of brown tobacco-y
Yeah.
southernness to it, and that gives a certain power and credibility to what he's saying, because he's also speaking in terms of knowing these people, and that's something we can get
Mhm.
into in a little bit. But his closeness to Forrest, but also his closeness to like if you're gonna have a historian speaking as he does, eloquently, but in a coat and tie in a lecture hall or something, that has a certain gravitas to it. But I don't know if it
Mhm.
has the power that Foote had, with the ability to have him the way he was, the way he was talking about, and of course what he was saying. And I think when we can get into this too, because where Foote is really interesting, I think, is that ideologically he doesn't fit neatly in what 2026 would look at. And I think that you have to make sense of Foote. You have to make sense of what Foote would look like in the 1950s, and Foote as a white Southern man in the 1950s is probably from a progressive strain, or at least an element of progressiveness in that. And that doesn't really come across necessarily in the 1980s and 90s, and it doesn't really come across now. But I think that's what makes him sort of a challenge, because but what he's arguing and what he's saying is sort of a time and place argument that doesn't really exist. Or it's hard to recapture. And I think that's part of it. And then, of course, there's all the stuff Foote says later in life that we can get into too, that is not ideologically mysterious. He's saying some really terrible things. But I think that's why he sort of has a certain power, because he doesn't fit neatly into any boxes in 1990. And he doesn't really make sense, really, we don't see too many people like that that still exist today. So I think it is sort of a curious mixture of ideas there.
Well, when I picked up the first volume last night to flip through the prologue, the original publication date is 58. So that makes sense what you're saying. So I mean, it's really, you know, rooted in the 1950s.
You know, and he's the other thing. This had a hold on me too, because one of my early real interests was in Southern Lit, and so you know he is not necessarily important in Southern Lit. Like, no one really looks at Shiloh, his novel, as like that's classic, but he's connected to a lot of important people. His best friend throughout his life was Walker Percy. He knows the Percy family. He knew Faulkner. He's connected to these people, and I think that is important as well. I mean, he knew Robert Penn Warren, he knew the agrarians, he knew Andrew Lytle, which we don't need to go into today, but we talked about last
Never
time
did.
with Niels. Lytle's important here too in the 30s, of sort of shaping these agrarian myths that Foote is not really a part of, but he doesn't shy away from them either. So, Andrew, you mentioned Fallen Timbers, which is the hoisting the soldier
Yeah.
on his, you know, Forrest is, this is outside of the Shiloh. This is after Shiloh, in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of Shiloh. And he
Yeah,
gets,
where the Confederates were retreating. Yeah.
and he's covering that, and he gets surrounded, and then ends up pulling up a Union soldier on his back. But then it becomes, is there some truth to any of this? There might be, but then it becomes like, well, he was shot, and he was, you know, Forrest with a bullet lodged near his spine is wrenching around. And I mean, there's, you know, people can say adrenaline does a lot, but there's also probably a lot of fantasy to this. But that story becomes so part of the Foote story, because Foote tells that story as if it's biblical fact, and I think that
Yeah.
that's important too. Well, this is a wild guy. That's a crazy story. And your brain, you have so much information hitting your brain with these episodes that you're like, well, I know nothing about this guy, but what an interesting thing. So I think that's part of it.
Well, as you guys were
Yeah.
talking about,
Yeah.
like Foote's house, right? So I can't picture it anymore from the documentary, but the picture I always still have in mind is Ed Beers in the documentary, right? How he's sitting in that armchair, kind of little low lying there, nicely dressed, and like all the arm movements, the kind of the energy that he has. I think it was very energetic in the way Ed Beers
uh,
communicated.
I might be wrong, but isn't he also one of the few that's on a battlefield? I think
I don't
Bierce also
remember.
shows up at a battlefield. I could be wrong. My memory's a little faulty on that.
But it's sort of
But
like the
he's kind
contrast,
of all over the
right?
place too. But he doesn't have the same sort of, yeah, 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 yeah,
And it's like
yeah.
like I watched the
Um,
documentary, or he did a tour at at Cowpans. That's a National Park Service videotaped. And he has this very kind of slow, eloquent, like almost like pastor like way of talking. And
yeah.
like it just doesn't, like in the documentary, in Ken Burns' documentary, it just doesn't come across like that. But I mean, if he had done it that way, he could have easily rivaled Foote
yeah.
in sort of personality and reach and kind of power.
Yeah, but then the editorial choice of Ken Burns
Of course.
allow so much space to Shelby Foote
Yes.
kind of
But
prevented that from happening.
if you're removed from the historical template, if you're removed from that world, and you're just an editor, a film editor looking at this stuff, you'd make that choice every day because you're thinking, well, this is a magnet. This is
Mhm.
a viewer magnet. So I think there's something in that is like, well, of course they would have done that. Of course they
Mhm.
saw Foote as the star. But I do think going back kind of to the larger point is that he's a novelist. He's a
Mhm.
writer and is interested in Shiloh. That's why he writes the novel on Shiloh. I think that's his second book. It's something like that. But anyway, the book is fairly well received. That ends up sort of putting him on the path with the publication of being asked to do the trilogy, which becomes the trilogy. I think he was originally asked to do just a history of the war, and then that became larger and larger and larger and larger and larger.
Mm.
But he's not a trained historian. He never saw himself as a trained historian, but he saw himself as a historian with a mindset. And so his version of history was, what did the person look like? What size shoes did they wear?
Mhm.
How did they walk into a room? All this stuff. That's what history to him was. These kind of great people arriving at different moments and how they interacted with everybody else. That's what he was interested in, which is why with a straight face he can say the two most important people were Abraham Lincoln and Bedford Forrest. That's a crazy combination. But if you're coming from Foote, that very much makes a lot of sense. It's like these are the two men that you feel like changed the molecules of the rooms they were in. And for him, that's what historical agency is all about. So he starts writing this history based kind of around these characters, and he sees them as characters. And I think that goes a long way to explaining why he has. I mean, there's a larger question as to why people want that more than they want academic history.
Mhm.
And academic historians have torn themselves up forever in terms of figuring that out. But there's a reason why some things just play well to a wider public than
Well,
not.
yeah, and just going back to the title of the trilogy is a narrative with the indefinite article. It's not the narrative; it's a narrative. So he's telling a story. He's not telling
Right.
the story of the Civil War. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, like
But
it's
I think that, he saw himself as writing the Iliad,
hmm.
really.
Yeah, which
I think that's what he saw himself charged. I think he saw himself
well,
charged with
so then
something
the
like that.
question that we can ask is this history or is this a novel?
Or a magic
Ah,
third thing. I mean, it's not
Magic
history
Sword say
in
what
any
Magic
real
Sword
way.
say. I think you sound like my
It's
kid.
kind of a novel. It's like a novelist. What?
Niels, you
Right.
are cutting.
It's something
Niels, you
that's
are cutting out. You're
Uh,
frozen.
again, like it sounds like my kid. Magic stories.
there
That's
we
it
go.
is. Yes.
I just think that there's probably it's hard. It's not history because it doesn't have the framework of academic history. It's historicized. It's historical. I mean, the thing is that he was very. If you're looking at source material, he wants to kind of basically give life to the official records. So he's very much connected to the OR, the official records of the war. Um, if it was in there, he saw it as valid. Anything that wasn't in there was kind of up for grabs. And I think that when you're looking at Foote, to say it's not history is to not say he wasn't dealing with source material or he wasn't just inventing. It's that he's not interested in the larger questions that historians generally ask from a professional standpoint. But what he was interested in, it was taking source material and giving it life. So there is an element there. But I think he did see himself. He talks about Marcel Proust all the time. I mean, I think he saw himself as like a some sort of mix of Homer and Proust, and I think that is kind of what comes out of it is 3 volumes. That is someone a white Southern writer interested in being a Proustian Homeric scholar of the Civil War. Um, And I think that that's probably close to what he ends up doing. Now, whether or not that connects to any academic worldview is up for grabs. But then if you take these other things too, like with slavery, and he gets a little wavery with this later in life, but like he's against slavery. He has like this sort of left of center white Southern take. I say this in the book, but I think it's important is that above his desk he has Robert pictures of Robert Johnson, Elvis Presley, and Forrest. And if you're thinking of Elvis, Robert Johnson, and Forrest, what worldview brings those three together? And I think that's a fairly unique worldview. And I say unique with every value leached from it, but I think it's a fascinating look at Foote. I mean, Foote, who would have seen Elvis in Memphis, Foote, who was a big listener of the blues and Robert Johnson and the Delta blues, and then Foote, who's obsessed with, no, I shouldn't say obsessed, but quite interested in Forrest. These are all North Mississippi, um, part of the North Mississippi constellation, and Foote is too. And so for him to be part of that, I think it sounds strange, but it also makes perfect sense. I mean, he's taking all of these pieces, what he does with them, how he views uh, African Americans, all of those other important questions, I think derive from that. But I think it's important to realize too that he is coming from a particular time and place, and he's writing from a particular time and place, and he's wanting to write a novelistic narrative of a story. I think history for him is a story, and I think that's important too.
Okay, so then a question that I've had since since Niels, you and I talked about about doing this talk. Um, well, actually, it's kind of a kind of a two-part question. Um, Comparing Foote to, say, Bruce Catton, writing at the same time with his trilogy, and
It's
then
interesting, yeah.
well, and then again, the second part is who is actually reading this, and Bruce Catton.
Um, who's who's reading Bruce Catton? Is that what you said?
Who's reading Shelby Foote and or Bruce Catton? Which part of the population? Um, because it's right at the cusp of the centennial. Bruce Catton, the centennial. Um, Bruce Catton, also not a trained historian, um, writing in a similar way, but much more, um, much closer to what we see in the Academy. Of course, without the footnotes, without the
A lot more Grant. There's a lot more Grant, I think, and stuff.
yeah,
But I think it's an interesting dichotomy because you have. I mean, I've always thought Catton was a little bit more of a had more of a sober assessment, right? Like he had a little bit more of a. I think he's a trained journalist, correct?
that's it. Yeah, yeah.
And I think that he has the journalistic element in it, which might make him hew closer to what he's reading. Um, I mean, let's be honest. There's a reason why Foote is. I would love to know, like, at some point, certainly by the 1990s, what those two trilogies would look like sales wise. Because Catton was everywhere too. Because when the civil, I mean, Catton was
He was the
gone.
guy.
He died. But Catton was a very well known source at that point. I don't know where he is now in the pantheon of Civil War kind of those large scale books, but there, it's again kind of like what Foote was doing would be engaging in a way that maybe Catton wasn't, because Catton wasn't interested in bending a story to the level that maybe Foote was. Um, that might sound that's probably a bit harsh on either side. Um, but I think that's interesting. And it is interesting too that Catton is sort of a kind of the Michigan versus the Mississippi kind of
Yeah.
take on all of this. I think there's a lot of things you could do with that. I'll be honest, I haven't looked at I haven't gone back to Catton in a very long time. I don't know how well it holds up
It's
under
a it
scrutiny
is
now
an
too.
it's a very good read. I read it for the first time. I mean, I had it for a long time, but my wife got me the Library of America, the recent edition, with the introduction by Gary Gallagher, and it's yeah, it holds up as an excellent read, as a classic in American writing. It's
Mm,
really good.
mm.
Um, and you don't have to necessarily take things with a huge grain of salt, in the same way you do with Foote, because I mean, it, everything is so romanticized in Civil War, in the narrative, and uh, that how, how do you know? For example, I mean, on the first page, just on the first page of the prologue, uh, it's just, as a trained historian, you know, the occasion was momentous and expected. The galleries were crowded. Hoop-skirted ladies and men in broadcloth came to hear him say farewell. Nathan Jefferson Davis. He was going home. So what about the hoop-skirted? So do we have documentation of how they were dressed?
It's funny you bring that up. There's a very well-known historian who's passed on many years ago, but in one of his more well-known books, the very first paragraph is looking through a spyglass, and the glint of the sun hits it. And my first thought was, did he look up the weather report? Does he know that it was a sunny day? Did the person who he's talking about write in his journal how, and those are the kind of things that probably ruin you as a as a writer for the mass public when you're like, that true? Were there hoop skirts? Was it sunny? But then, like, really,
What were they wearing broadcloth?
right. And there's also some very talented historians who are very talented writers who are able to play with that in a way that is realistic. But then you have others who are just like, well, I'm sure they were wearing this, and it's going to show off my definitions of 19th century fabrics or whatever it is. And I don't know, and then you get stuck because like none of that is meaningful, right? Like my criticism isn't meaningful of the sentence of theirs that isn't meaningful. And now it's kind of like, is this what we've become? But I do think there's something there in terms of accuracy and also what would you say? Kind of uh, veracity.
Well,
Is this a
well,
truthful
so
account? Is this an
but
account
but
that's
but as someone
authentic?
who's writing, as we who are writing, uh, academically, uh, academic history, make sure the sources are all correct, everything's cited and sources. Um, that may have been in a newspaper account from, the Washington correspondent who was talking about that and mentioned it, because, with my work on Andrew Johnson, of course, I'm looking a lot at newspapers and getting getting reporter takes on what's happening, and they get into details like that. Um, so I
Right.
mean, it's quite possible that, what the women were in hoop skirts and all that, and he found that information in, a newspaper. If he'd looked at a newspaper, it wouldn't have been in the OR, of course. Um, but
But I think what happens is that you become like that's where historians always become kind of like pedants and scolds and then write a book that seven people
yeah.
read. And I don't know if that's an old argument too. And I don't know if there's an actual answer to it, except that when you read really good history written by people who really bring in all of it, there's a capable way of doing it and a less capable way of doing it. So I'm not saying that you can't do it, and I also don't think that it can be the death of footnotes too. It'd be just like I'll bury everything in footnotes. But as someone who's sort of uh, maybe at this stage of my career thinking more broadly about how you write about the past, maybe there's something else in that vein. I mean, that's not how I write, that's not how I think. So I wouldn't necessarily start a series that way. But you've brought this up though, and I think it's interesting that that's how the book starts, right? That's a fascinating, however you want to go about it, whatever you write first is important psychologically and methodologically and historiographically. And to start with that, I think is fascinating. I had forgotten that's how it starts. Um,
Well, I mean,
that's a series of interesting questions. Like if that's
well,
where it starts, then where is it going? Where is it?
well, I
Where
mean,
is he?
he
Where is
immediately
he
starts
headed?
with his opening character is Jefferson Davis. I mean, so opening this the Civil War narrative,
Right.
who is it going to be about? Well, it's going to be about Jefferson Davis.
Where the other part of this that's come in the background is that yes, he probably Foote probably sees a Southern bias and I mean, anti-Southern bias in the way the war is reported. That's a lost cause piece. But he's also writing from Mississippi, and he's coming from a Western theater where he believes that there's too much focus on Virginia.
Yeah.
So I think there's probably all those things are embedded in this in terms of like, let's tell a story this other way. There's also, if you bring up Jefferson Davis, you're automatically talking about Confederate nationalism because you have this the structure of the Confederacy right there. And there's also the irony, and Foote is a great lover of irony. So maybe there's an idea that if we start with Davis, that we know ends in such a kind of a ridiculous ending, then maybe there's something in an ironic undertone here that's working too. I mean that's where Foote is a novelist. Foote is thinking in terms of Chekhov rather than, Bruce
Yeah.
Catton, perhaps.
So did you find it, Niels?
Find it?
Did you get your first? Yeah. Did you find your book?
No, I actually pulled a different book.
Ah.
It in in
Ah.
in
Oh, okay.
in part what I was thinking about while you guys were talking is the one thing I remembered the most about Food was the number of times he has people talking, right? Like the conversations, the kind of dialogue he puts in there at times. And I guess the question becomes a little bit of like, is this imaginary? Is this real? Is this like where does this all come from? How would you know? And that sort of reminded me of Freelinks's book because the first volume, and they're about 10 years apart. The first volume had a lot of conversations. And I remember when I read the preface for the second volume, he had a very interesting statement that I'm going to read to you guys. My narrative style has changed more than my analysis during the 15 years since I wrote volume one. The aging process has sustained my taste for characters, location, and confrontations, but I have lost some zest for nicknames, imaginary conversations, and plays on words. So I kind of wonder if that's sort of like, is
Uh,
that what people wanted during this time? Sort of like this, it makes a book more accessible if you have sort of this imaginary conversation that seems still plausible, but it's still imaginary.
well, it's like cinema. I mean, think about Lincoln, the movie, the Spielberg movie.
Mm.
Um, how much
Yeah, but that's
how much
based on
creative
Doris Karen
license?
Goodwin. I mean, we don't need to talk about that.
Well, no, but there's still a lot of imagined
Hmm.
exchanges and conversations,
Right.
um, and it comes down to creative license. And so, should we afford the same creative license to Foote or to uh, Bill Freeling or to Catton as we do Spielberg?
I mean, I don't think that I'm a bit removed from grad school, and I'm a bit removed from a doctoral program. So I don't know what the conversations necessarily would be at this point in terms of the hallways of grad students, right? But it'd be interesting to see when I was in grad school in the late 90s was the beginning, well, not the beginning, but that's kind of the tail end of the culture war. Well, that iteration of culture wars, kind of the Enola Gay era culture wars. And I think that the conversations were all very much about these questions, right? About how far do you go? How far, is it too stretching it too far? Um, I think you're going to allow a Spielberg to do these kind of things or a filmmaker to do these things because they're trying to operate on another level of truth telling or another level of storytelling. Doesn't make it more historical. It just means that is it getting it sort of there? Is it giving us an image of what happened? And there's plenty of historical movies that do a pretty good job, even though you see like speeches switched up or people say things that they wouldn't have said, but someone else would have said. But in the historian world, it seems like those conversations are sort of very much of the past because that was coming out. That's kind of what Niels was saying. There's like a period when that was much more acceptable or allowable, kind of that public, I don't know what language I would say here, the kind of the public or mainstream approach to history writing allowed for this because it's coming from Random House and Vintage and Knopf and these presses that were much more interested in telling these grand stories. Maybe that's part of it. Um, and also part of it is probably maybe a sort of dismissiveness of is like the prude historical mind that was less interested in the story and more interested in fact finding. Um, I think there's all that stuff built into that. I think the story of objectivity is much more different now than it would have been in 1989. Uh, it'd be interesting to go back and see if objectivity was even discussed at that point. I don't know how much of that of the argument was. I think all of those things, though, are much more a part of the world of the 90s and the 2000s and onward. That's my take on it. That's my feeling for it. But also, here's the other thing: is like we haven't really seen anything since then, right? I mean, what's the post Foote uh trilogy? Is there a room for that? Is there a necessity for that? Is there a call for that? Is there a way that I mean, so we are now 26, what are we? 75 years away from the first Foote volume, and 75 years before him would have put him on like Reconstruction. So you wonder if is there space and time? I mean, I'm assuming it's just a basic point of like readership and money and uh, capitalism more than politics as to exist anymore. If you went to any publisher and said, I want to do a 3 volume on anything, they'd probably just even some curiosity about what that would look like. Like what would it like what about the nature of biography, the story of biography? I mean, this is what I talk about in the book too, is that Foote never writes a biography of Forrest. He seems like he'd be the person to write a biography of Forrest, but he's not interested in biography on that level because you have to be true to what you know and what you have to a certain extent. Otherwise, he's doing what Andrew Lytle did, which is a bunch of myth making. And that's not what he wanted to do, however much he connected to them. So then it's kind of like, well, where are we with biography these days? Is that the version of narrative that we have? If we look at film, it's the biopic. If we're looking at these other things, biographies and memoirs, they still have a cachet. Um, so I don't know. I think that tastes have shifted quite a bit. I think part of it is graduate training and academics, but I think it's also just tastes have shifted to a degree that these things just seem less necessary. Um,
Well,
I don't know.
but it also seems like there are a lot more PhDs who are not going into academia and who are moving more toward kind of, I don't know what you call it, like Megan Kate Nelson, more
Mm.
public facing, popular popular histories of things that ended up making the New York Times bestseller list. Um,
Right, and I think there's like a newer group of people who are much more willing, not willing, or perhaps more able to do that. I think if you go back to like the generation before that, you have people like Charles Royster, who was still able to write pretty big books that were still on, big budgeted ideas. And he's writing from a historian's perspective that was also a little bit more novelistic. But was able to, I think he's a good example. If you look at like the Destructive War or something, he's able to use images and he's able to use writing in a way that gives you a sense of purpose and place, but also from a historical underlying. I think someone like Nelson's interesting in this world. I think what we're going to see is because people are not turning against academia. Academia sort of imploded, and the gates just
Well,
somebody
and
we
then,
can't get into it, but
well, I was gonna say the politics of 2025 and 2026. I mean, it's going to be it's a massacre in higher ed.
you know, uh, not to get us into this completely, but if you see like the book exhibits of large conferences now, they're just obliterated. Uh, Presses don't go. The presses that used to be the mainstays don't have several booths; they have one. You can just tell if you go to the Southern, if you go to the AHA, there is a level there where just the book exhibit part of it, which used to be sort of the piece, is just not where it was. Now, that's not to say that presses aren't interested. And you have a lot of good presses, and you have a lot of great editors, and you have a lot of great people really wanting good stuff. And that stuff is probably more true now than it's ever been. But in terms of someone able to get past that in like the literary agent world where they're writing really good history, but with the ability to reach more people and get them into the bookstores, however they exist. I think that is interesting. Um,
Well, but
I'm not the one to know this stuff. I just feel there's still a place for all sorts of great stuff. It's just, that weird metric of finding the audience. And we didn't really get to your question earlier, Andrew, the idea of who's reading these books. I mean,
Yeah, that was the question I was going to ask again. I
I
mean,
think the question is with Foote, everyone was reading Foote. A lot of people were reading Cat, and like they were kind of it's like Robert Caro. We haven't brought his name into it. Like these are people who were, you know, the literati, really. I mean, Robert Caro was certainly is part of the, was part of, he's still alive, but that kind of that party scene, like the Didion world or whatever.
well, but I think that
I mean,
goes to
it's
another point too, to
But I
kind
think
of
he's interesting too, because Caro, what's that?
well, I
there's
kind
so
of
much to say.
sorry,
Yeah,
but
it became crazy there for a second. Niels,
I
what?
kind of was feeling like where Andrew was asking like and you both are like who's reading this and what's this like no one is going to publish a 3 volume set today. No publisher is crazy enough doing that, right? And we're talking not like 300 pages. We're talking like almost 1,000, I think, in volume 3. Like, I mean, I remember I was at the AHA in, I don't remember, like 2010 or so, and I think it was in Chicago, and people were talking about Battle Cry of Freedom by McPherson, and it's like, oh, it's almost 30 years old. We should update that, and there's no update. Oxford hasn't even published the whole series yet for that, right? Right. So it's like, is there what kind of market do we have for like massive books? All presses, like I have encountered one 250 page books. That's
Well, I think
it.
that's Well, I think that's a great point, Niels. I think McPherson is a great
Well,
example from some of this stuff because that was that last gasp. Like McPherson and
mhm.
Foner were able to write large drafts,
Yeah, Foner
and
with
and
that
and,
with
and those
construction. Yeah.
became sort of like the book stop version of that. And then the other part of it too is how many people actually did read all 3 volumes of Foote. I mean, there was a fair amount of people, and the 60s and 70s is a different readership time. And McPherson was very well received. Foner was clearly well received. Um, but I think you're right. I think if you went to a publisher and said, I've got a 300,000 word manuscript, they're like, great, come back when it's 80. And that's just the nature of it. Like if you're an intro author, if it's your first book, you're not gonna have that. Um, there's very little space for that. And that's just the nature of the economics of the academic press world. But even beyond that, like they're like, well, We don't have libraries buying it anymore. Those don't exist. So who's gonna how do we come up with the first 3,000 orders? It's gonna be tough.
Hmm. Now, I was looking at my bookshelf as you were saying that. Curran's, I don't know how long her book is. It's it's pretty thick too. Team of Rivals is
Mhm. But that's trade press too, so I mean there's not a lot of new books of that nature.
pretty current. Is it active press? No, but is Oxford University Press the company? Is it academic or is it pseudo academic? Is it uh, so? My question
Mhm.
there for Michael Holt's book on the Whig Party, which is like 900 pages or something. I mean, it's a massive, massive book. Uh, yeah,
I don't think those days are coming back. I just don't see it. I mean, Oxford clearly has, it has its wings that are as academic as anything else, and then they just cover a large amount of ground. But I just don't see those days coming back. I mean, that seems like the kind of the green pastures, which at the time people thought like it was as terrible then as ever. Um, but Holt's book, what is that? That's because it might be a thing that most of these books were all posted between like 95 and 2005 or something. Um, but I think there's something about that just it just seems like so far from us now.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, because you look at university presses and 250, 300, 300 and 350 actual pages with the bibliography and index up. And that's it.
and there's something as someone who writes 200-page books, there's something to be said to that. But I also think that it's like, when that becomes the only standard, or if that becomes, and that's not coming from anything in particular. I don't think there's a conspiracy against it as much as there's like just a panoply of reasons as to why that's true. Primarily just who's going to buy it and who's going to read it and who's going to go with it. And maybe I don't know. Maybe that's changing a little bit. I don't know, but I feel like we are easily a quarter century away from those kind of books being published regularly, and I don't know. Um, you know, I don't know what the future has in store. Um, I do think going back to Foote, which is interesting though, is that he was kind of the time in the place, and he was able to get these things through when you did have like Book of the Month Club, and you did have a
Hmm.
readership that was quite large, and you
Mm.
still had the ability to connect to these larger viewers, and then I mean readers, and then he has the great fortune of having Robert Penn Warren give his name to Ken Burns. Because I think Burns actually wanted Warren to talk because he had written some stuff, obviously, and then he's like, "Well, what about Shelby?" And then that becomes any author's dream of being on a very well received PBS special at that time. So I think it's just all those moments lined
I
up for
think
him in such a way too.
Yeah, but
well received, I think, underplays it.
Of Kim Burns, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just saying. So
Yeah.
it's just like all of a sudden, you
I
know.
well, but I think the other part here is
But if
that
you're looking at,
mean, superstar.
yeah,
I was kind of thinking of the danger, right? Of like, I mean, we
Yeah,
already
Niels.
mentioned a number of times that like some of the stuff that Foote writes about that gets in this gig is of dubious origin, right? And you put somebody like that telling these stories of dubious origin to millions of viewers over years, because I'm pretty sure Ken Burns is still shown on some in some school classrooms today. Like that has a big impact, right? Of adding myth to the Civil War narrative.
and it's a myth that you have sort of it plays into the underdog. It plays in. I mean, it does play into a version of the lost cause.
Hmm.
It plays with Forrest. you see such a gigantic uptick in references to Forrest because after PBS, after Foote, you have two big biographies. You have the Hearst biography, which is more of a journalistic biography. You have the Brian Steele Wills biography that comes out that's more of the military history. Those two books come out in the early 90s. You start seeing Forrest stuff everywhere. And you have the Nashville statue that goes up at the end of the 90s. That's not all directly in line with Foote, but it almost is entirely in line with Foote. Like Foote creates that. I think the 90s is such a Forrest philic period because you just start seeing people in Congress using Forrest quotes. Got their firstest with the mostest. All that stuff becomes like the language of warfare and the language of politics. With divorced completely from who Forrest was. You don't have to know who Forrest was except to know, yeah, he got there firstest with the mostest. Which came out in the 50s is stacks and stacks of that. Every Barnes and Noble you've ever gone to. If you went in 1995 to a Barnes and Noble, you're going to see stacks of Robert Self Henry's book. And the quote that I've used so often in my life with Foote, but he calls Forrest in the documentary the most man in the world. And the most man in the world sums it up so well because he sees him as like this giant who was he never really there's never a moment when Foote is like, when I say the most man, I mean this. But he uses that quote a lot, and he's talking about like the larger than lifeness of Forrest. And so many people who had no working idea of the Civil War now had a person they could talk about. It's like when they watch the baseball documentary and they find the one person that they never heard of before that becomes kind of the fun part of that documentary or whatever it is. And there's a reason why people want that because it gives them an insider knowledge that they didn't already know. Forrest was not that well known outside of the South. He wasn't that certainly in the 20th century. He wasn't that well known outside of Tennessee. But by the 90s, he's like everyone's like, oh yeah, all of a sudden you see Civil War posters and he's on there. And so it's kind of like what is happening here?
Well, and it, kind of an aside, when I was kind of throwing the really wide net, getting into my dissertation, working on looking at memory, I found a bunch of articles from kind of all over the English speaking world about the American Civil War, and one from the UK really stood out from um, the 2005 2010 period. A British journalist was talking about the American Civil War, talking about it was at the time of the sesquicentennial. So it was 2011, 2012. And talking about the Ken Burns series, and for him, the writer was a man. The series was Shelby Foote, and Shelby Foote really symbolized um, the telling of the American Civil War and the memory and everything, and that's what drew British British viewers to watch it and really devour the Ken Burns series, even as late as the 2000s, even 2010, and so it remained kind of the standard, the go-to for American Civil War history. So, yeah, Shelby Foote.
It has legs, and I don't think it's hard to underrepresent what it meant, especially in terms of non-academics to have and I guess you could argue they have a better sense of the Civil War than they did. And it's the thing is, in its aggregate, Ken Burns is not. This is what's so kind of fascinating. Ken Burns is actually not telling a Shelby Foote story. The story of the Civil War for him is not a Shelby Foote narrative, but Shelby Foote plays such an outsized role in it. Because I don't think he would underside. I don't think Burns is going to say, yeah, Fort Pillow is an amazing victory for the Confederates. I don't think that's where Burns is coming from. I think Burns is telling a sort of centrist, sort of composite story of the Civil War. I think there's a lot of ways you can attack Burns's approach, but I don't think he's telling a lost cause necessarily Southern version of the story. But so much of his story is heavily italicized by Foote. So it's like you're bringing in him so much, regardless of what your viewpoint is, Foote kind of takes it over. And
Yep.
Burns isn't on screen telling his version, right? Burns is saying about all that it's not just. I think the documentary of the Civil War is not just a Foote story, but Foote takes such an oversized role in it that it'd be hard pressed for people to distance themselves, to distance the two viewpoints.
Well, and then
I mean, Barbara J. Fields is in.
well, yeah, okay, so that's something else. But what I wanted to say is that it's such a there's such a juxtaposition between what Foote these stories he's telling stories for the documentary, for the whole thing. He's telling stories, but you've also got primary sources that are being used in the narration by David McCullough. Or you have all these actors, all these voice actors, all these these famous people reading letters from different uh, uh, different protagonists from the war. You have Grant. You have the letters of Elijah Hunt Foote telling stories.
Others go to war story. I mean, I think that's kind of what his basic thing is that slavery must be destroyed, that it was right for Lincoln to be the hero of the moment, and all that, which I think Shelby would co-sign to. But what he wants to tell is
Yeah.
the two brothers go off to war. And I think that's where he finds the romanticism within the war. There's that kind of Whitman strain through that. And I think that, there's a place for all that. I do think that with Foote, he tells the fallen timber story with that. He tells the story of and Burns shows this too, Forrest, if you want to whip some Yankees and have a good time sort of appeal. But then the kind of the famous part too is that Foote talks about swinging Forrest's sword. So he's actually touching, and Niels and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but this idea of like Foote's proximity to Forrest is important to this because he is not close to Forrest geographically, though he's actually connected to the family a little bit. Like he knew his granddaughter.
Yeah, let's say he had access to
yeah, and that's what's so interesting. And I talk about this too, but like it's a telescoping of time because if you're listening to Foote in 1990 on a PBS subsidiary and you're watching it, he's talking about not that long ago. He says some quote like not long ago or whatever. He had the pleasure of for a sword and waving it over his head. But it's a telescoping of time because she died in the 50s. So what he's telling is a story that was easily 50 years old when he's telling it, but it makes it seem like it's just happened. So you have this interesting sort of collapsing of like Foote has a voice and he has a presence because he's so close to this. Forrest is well far away. He'd been dead 130 years, but now you have someone who not only touched Forrest's sword, but Forrest's family was still around, and it gives a sense of. I don't think Foote's doing this purposefully in the sense of that. I don't think he's doing a sleight of hand necessarily, but he's collapsing a time frame where it makes him seem right there. I mean, Foote was born in the 19 teens, so he would have been in the 70s when he's being interviewed. But he's talking about something that happened to him when he was probably 30. I think that's interesting. I think that's an interesting sort of collapsing that happens, which then gives you power because when you're talking about Forrest and you're like, oh, this guy touched his sword. And spoiler alert, he's buried his burial plot's like 15 yards away from where Forrest was buried. So it's like when you see where Forrest had been buried because he's dug up and put under the statue, and then he's reburied later. But that plot is like just right across from where Foote is buried. So that's there's something kind of interesting, poetic there too, I suppose, however you want to look at it. But there's a proximity to Forrest that gives him a certain power. If you had someone else going, bah, 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 they're like, yeah, but you're talking about someone from the past, like I'm from the past. No one cares. But Foote's like, oh yeah, I had lunch with Forrest. I mean, he didn't, but it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Those stories have a relevance, but they have an authenticity that they shouldn't have because he's telling it. So he's telling it with his drawl and his pipe smoke fantasia of a den, and then he's touching all this stuff. So I think that is a big part of why he plays off. He doesn't ever have to come in and say, well, historiographically, this is why it had to happen this way. He doesn't have to come in and even talk about the large scale military reasons for stuff. That's not his point. His point is kind of the color commentator who then takes over the game.
Yeah. Well, um, going back to the Barbara J. Fields. Um, so for me, well, one of the really negative aspects of the Ken Burns series was Shelby Foote being the main character of the entire 9-part series, is that it skewed my view of academic history of history and historians, because women, Barbara J. Fields, for example, plays such a small role in the documentary series. So for me, for a long time, and it took me a long time to get past this, a historian was a man. Historian was a white man.
Hmm.
And I do blame Ken Burns and his inclusion of as much Shelby Foote as he did, as being one of the kernels of one of the germination of this skewed version of what history is and who makes history.
And who writes history? There's a casualness to it too. Like, well, this is just what it was.
Right.
Burns is not an apologist for Burns, and Burns does not really spend a lot of time, I think, on stuff from the past. I mean, ironically, right? But I never got the sense that Burns is all that caught up in like what does the Civil War mean today, other than that it's an American story. Baseball is an American story. The American Revolution is an American story. And that's the Burnsian approach. It's like these are the things that tell us about the greatness and the tragedy and in some ways that is the Foote story, right? It is the Iliad, however you want to look at it. But what you're saying is absolutely true in the sense that in the 80s and into the 90s, he defines what a historical documentary is, but he's also defining who's in it. And I think that it's like, well, you're going to see you're going to have a Doris Kearns Goodwin, you're going to have a Barbara J. Fields, but you're going to have massive amounts of everybody else. So I think that does have an impact. I think it has an impact in a way that's hard to catalog. I think it's an impact that's hard to sort of quantify, but I think it's very real. And I think there's a lot of people who came up into that just thinking, well, history is a bunch of stories told kind of quietly by white men.
Yeah. Well, and then that would explain, for me, kind of, I noticed this a long time ago, but the 1990s, like, post 92, 93, you have just tons of women's history, women in the Civil War. So, and I think is that in some way a reaction to the male dominated Ken Burns series?
I think that's an interesting question. I think by the 90s, everything breaks open for the Civil War. I think for the first time, the Civil War in a long time had been like, then it kind of opened the gates for a large number of studies, certainly from an academic perspective. I think that was probably the high point of the of the Civil War academically, because that's when you see so much coming out. And I think that has something to do with that.
Well, and then you have, like this, for example, came out right at the same time that the that the documentary was being shown for the first time. So yeah, you've got, questioning of things too.
Well, for me, I ended up working when I went to LSU. I started working with Gaines Foster, and he was the one who worked on the early parts of the master's thesis, which became kind of the Memphis part of the book many years later. But Foster was incredibly important to me because Foster wrote Ghosts of the Confederacy, which was kind of the first dismantling of the Lost Cause that I was able to read. And it was the first time I began to place myself within a story that looked different from the story that I had kind of been given. So whatever I was looking at in high school and everything I was looking kind of in college. So college was a little bit different, but I was learning kind of the early historical skills in college as you do, whatever, research papers. But it was Foster who wrote such a important book, and that comes out in the early 80s of, well, this is how this stuff gets created. And that, even though he's not really our takes on things are a little different, obviously, but I think his was the first book, and getting to know him, working with him, was the first time again to realize, oh, there's a deeper irony to all of this. And this is not accidental. It's crafted, it's built, and it's built on these series of stories that are trying to create white supremacy or however angle you want to take.
Well,
And that
and
was so he was the antidote for a lot of that. I was fortunate to have him very early on in my career.
well, what changed it for me? What really broke the I guess the crust, the outer shell of the Lost Cause that was keeping me boxed in was a combination of the Marble Man, it was Thomas Connolly wrote that, right?
Connolly's book, yeah.
Yeah, Nolan, um, and then this is not that long ago for me, which is it is what it is. But oh, what's the book? Talks about the Lost Cause.
Charles
Karen
Reagan
Cox.
Wilson's book. Oh, Karen Cox, yeah.
Yeah, Karen Cox. I mean, and that essentially broke it down. But creating a Confederate Kentucky. So it was, for a long time I'd been separated from American history. I did French history for a long time. So my master's is in French history. So getting back into the Civil War, I still had that Ken Burns, that contamination from Ken Burns, and that remained for a long time, longer than it should have, honestly. But yeah, so reading Gaines Foster as well. That's a great book. I mean, it really.
We got into a lot of fights over that book because that book, because you have Charles Reagan Wilson's book and then Gaines Foster's book. And Wilson's book is a little different. It's more of the civic religion part of it, like the Lost Cause as a civic religion.
As a religion.
And Foster's isn't. Foster's is like, there's a time and place for this. There's a reason why by the 1880s into the 1900s, all these people are turning the way they are. And I just found his way more perceptive, and it made more sense to me. And that was kind of like when I started working on Forrest, I was never working on the Civil War. I was always working on 1905 Memphis. And the understanding was that 1905, the statue in Memphis tells us a lot about 1905 Memphis. It tells us certainly a lot more about 1905 Memphis than it does Forrest. And that was all. That was sort of the angle I was taking by 1997, 1998. And I think that was an important corrective of understanding that the Lost Cause wasn't something that just was. It was something that was built and rebuilt and built and rebuilt and protected and protected and protected. And I think that some people tend to think that it's something that just, well, that's my grandfather or great grandfather thought that, but it gets passed down so many different ways in terms of textbook. We don't have to adjudicate that, but I do think that's a way of looking at it that really was powerful in terms of how public memory is shaped, how public memory works. And I think any monument history, any history of memorialization, you could go back to, and you should go back to like Durkheim and everybody, but you can also need to look at how this stuff is crafted and created in the South, and it's all over the place.
Yeah. Well, the Wilson book spoke to me more because in France they have this kind of state anti-religion called laïcité, which is secularism, that's almost its own religion. So it made more sense to me looking at the Lost Cause as a civil religion, you know, based on these myths, um, you know, in the immediate post Civil War, from the immediate post Civil War era. Um,
Well, thanks for having me.
We're
We'll
getting
we'll
there.
get we'll get that in there just so you can have me say goodbye at least at some point.
I don't think you're going to get your final question, Andrew.
yeah, it's all right. So yeah, no,
Oh,
yeah. For me, a narrative of the Civil War doesn't really make any sense anymore,
Well, I
because
think there's a larger question. I think what you're getting at is actually a larger, more interesting question, which is like, do we the idea of narrative history, the idea of these, is there a that going to build? Because then it becomes like an idea of perfectionism, right? That history is just building blocks to something that finally is complete. But that's not kind of the role of the narrative either. The role of the narrative is its own thing. So I think it's actually a very kind of fascinating question. But for what I'm interested in, I'm more interested like the historian of memories. Like I'm interested in it because what it can tell us about whatever's going on at that time. But I don't have an interest in it in terms of like
yeah.
reading a narrative.
Well, I'm asking the question because in France, people read a lot. I mean, they read and read and read, and there are countless, just countless narrative histories of things. Um, and they, different authors do a narrative of the same thing, and so you have, a narrative of the Hundred Years' War. You have a narrative of the Napoleonic Wars. You have a narrative of the French Revolution. You have a narrative, and I don't know how many books have been written on the French Revolution, but it's crazy. So, Michelet's History of France. You got this history of France, this other history of France. You've got History of France for Dummies. You've got all these histories of France. Um, these giant narrative, it's giant narrative volumes that are 1,000 pages long, 1,500 pages long. I mean, just massive books, and people buy them, people read them, and yeah. But I don't think where does the American Civil War fit in the American readership of where would a narrative of the American Civil War fit in the American readership today? That's
I,
the
I,
question.
I really don't know. I mean, I honestly, I feel like there's still really good books on the Civil War coming out every year. We have really good scholarly takes that are inventive and unique, and we still have spaces. It's that whole thing. We'll have infinite ways of talking about it, but that's not the question. The question is like, do we have a way of talking about it on a grander scale that might appeal to a larger audience? And I guess the answer, honestly, might be sure. Um, but I don't know if we have the capabilities of that anymore in terms of making that happen. Um, it's interesting. It's an
Well,
interesting question.
and then Elizabeth Barron. I mean, she wrote what's it called? What's the title of the book? Her recent narrative, which is a narrative.
this is Lost Biography?
No, on Armies of Deliverance,
Hmm.
which in itself is a take on a narrative, from a certain perspective. Um, but it's not a narrative in the sense of Foote, who we're talking about. I mean, so could there be a new Shelby Foote to write something that would appeal to America, would appeal to a wider American audience today, and that would be viable for a publisher?
I don't think if Shelby Foote probably is coming back around uh, in all the good and bad ways. If we reduce him to someone who can spark people's imagination about the Civil War, maybe. Um, but I also feel I have kind of a strong cynical streak to all this in terms of as we move forward. Remember, like the recent anniversaries didn't really seem to go very far. It seemed like um, I don't know as it recedes, and I think there's two things that are happening with the Civil War. It's receding very quickly into the past for most kind of people who aren't academics, and I think it's quickly defining all of our present.
Yeah.
I think that's the truth of it. I think as a thing, it's vanishing, and as an idea, it's more present than ever. And I think
Yeah.
that that's the reality of the United States right now. And so maybe this whole moment, however this plays out, and if it plays out in a way that we can still talk about history in the next 10 years, maybe it'll reframe some of this. I think it will reframe a lot of this. And maybe we come to a point where we have to clear the decks and readdress a lot of these issues. Certainly, we have to do that on every level, but in terms of like narrative history, um, but maybe that's kind of the larger point, and it's kind of going back to what we've talked about before, the idea that something that seems further away than ever is also more present than ever. I think is a really um, scary concept because it means that no one is working under the knowledge of what happened and everyone's working under the impact of that. So
Yeah.
that's the cynical take we could end on for me.
Yeah.
I'm
And
okay
I'm,
with that.
yeah, me too. I mean,
Yeah.
that scary telescoping of history. I mean,
hmm Well, and also
I think about that all the time. Yeah.
the kind of the I don't want to say lies, but the kind of embellishments that he told in this over the years
yeah,
that
it became,
influenced such a large body of people.
well, and then you look if you go to YouTube, look at the videos there. I mean, they get pretty unhinged after a while.
Mm.
We're living in the age of
That's why you
embellishment.
don't need to watch this channel.
Yes.
Absolutely.
The antidote that you are offering.
Well, thank you
But
so much, and thanks for bearing with me on all the tech issues today. That was a unpleasant experience in many ways, but I
But
think
we
we
were
still had a
happy
good
that
conversation.
we were happy it worked out in the end.
Yes.
yes. And thank you for having me. This was quite interesting. So
Well,
Well,
thank you for
appreciate
being
that.
here. Thank you for
Yeah, thank
including me
you.
again.
Yeah. Thanks for
great.
carrying the conversation for once, Andrew.
I hope I didn't eclipse you too much.
I was totally fine. It was fun to listen.
All right.
Your nostalgia
Thank
was
y'all.
great. Thank you.
All right. Take care.